Something is changing across Africa, not in one country, not in one city, and it isn't happening with soldiers, flags, or military bases. It's happening quietly. A railway appears, then a highway, a new port, a power station, a telecommunication network, and then, almost unnoticed, the cameras arrive. Different countries, different governments, different projects, but increasingly, the same name keeps appearing behind them: China. Over the past 2 decades, Beijing has committed roughly $180 billion in loan to African governments and regional institutions. Chinese companies have helped build some of the continent's biggest infrastructure projects, and now the relationship is moving into something even more important: Africa's digital future, networks, data centers, 5G, artificial intelligence, smart city systems, surveillance technologies. At first glance, this may look like completely separate investments, but put them on the same map, and a different picture begins to emerge. Because China isn't simply building things in Africa, it is becoming deeply connected to the system that moves Africa's people, power its cities, connects its economics, and increasingly move its information. So why? Why Africa? Why now? And what does China want from a continent where it has already invested so much? The answer is not as simple as China is helping Africa. And it isn't as simple as China is taking Africa. The real story lies somewhere in between. Let's uncover something. For decades, African governments faced a frustrating problem. They need roads, they need electricity, they need railways, they needed ports, airports, factories, and telecommunications. But building modern infrastructures requires enormous amount of money that many developing countries simply did not have. The Western governments, the World Bank, and other international institutions provided financing, but often with conditions attached. Then, China arrived with a different model. Chinese state-backed lenders were willing to finance large infrastructure projects, while Chinese companies were often ready to design and construct them. The result was a formula that was extremely attractive to governments. You need infrastructure. China provides financing. Chinese companies build it, and the scale grew rapidly. Chinese lending to Africa surged during the 2000s and reached its peak around the following decade. The projects were enormous, massive, amazing. Railways, hydropower dams, highways, ports, government buildings, industrial parks, airports, power transmission systems. By the 2010s, China had become Africa's largest bilateral creditor and one of its most important economic partners. And the relationship was no longer just about development assistance. Trade was exploding.
Look, this is a 40-inch container. It's the biggest container. This container.
In 2024 alone, China-Africa trade reached roughly $295 billion. That means China was no longer simply building Africa. It was becoming deeply connected to what Africa produces, imports, and consumes. And that brings us to the first major question. If China is putting so much money into Africa, what does China get in return? To understand China's strategy, don't start with the speeches, follow the money. Chinese lending to Africa has been concentrated heavily in sectors such as energy and transportation. Between 2000 and 2023, Chinese lenders provided about $182 billion in development finance to African governments and regional borrowers. Energy alone accounted for more than $62 billion. Transportation accounted for more than $52 billion. These aren't random investments. They are the basic systems that allow an economy to function. A railway moves people and minerals. A port exports and imports. A highway connects factories to markets. Electricity allows industries to operate. And telecommunications allow information to move. Build enough of these systems, and you don't just build infrastructure, you help shape the economic network around it. But there is another important part of the Chinese model. The financing and construction are often closely connected. A Chinese lender provides financing for a project. A Chinese engineering or construction company may then win the contracts. Chinese machinery, equipment, and expertise can become part of the projects. That does not mean every Chinese-funded project works this way, and it would be misleading to claim that all the money simply returns to China. But the structure can create an important economic advantage for Chinese companies. China is not only lending money overseas, it is also creating overseas markets for its companies, technology, equipment, and industrial capacity. And this matters because China has something Africa desperately needs: infrastructure. But Africa also has something China increasingly needs too. Look beneath the surface of the continent. Copper, cobalt, oil, lithium, manganese, iron ore, bauxites, and many other strategic resources. Some are essential to modern industries, from batteries and electric vehicles to electronics and energy infrastructure. China is already deeply involved in global supply chains for many of these materials, but resources are only one part of the equation. Africa is also the world's youngest major region demographically. Its population is growing rapidly. Its cities are expanding. Its middle classes are developing, and hundreds of millions of people are expected to enter the consumer market over the coming decades. For Chinese companies, that represents something extraordinary: a full market, phones, cars, solar panels, construction equipment, financial technology, internet services, telecommunications, consumer goods, and there is something else: geography. Africa sits beside some of the world's most important shipping routes. The Suez Canal connects Europe and Asia. The Red Sea connects the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. The Horn of Africa sits beside one of the world's most strategically important maritime corridors. So Africa isn't simply a place where China can sell products. It's a continent connected to global trade. And this explains why China's relationship with Africa is about much more than loans. But then, China began doing something even more interesting. It started building infrastructure that cannot be seen from the road. For years, when people hear the word China in Africa, they imagine cranes, railways, and highways. But the next stage is different, because the most important infrastructure of the 21st century may not be made of concrete. It may be made of fiber, data centers, cloud computing, artificial intelligence, 5G networks, satellites, digital payment systems, and surveillance technology. China calls one part of this strategy the Digital Silk Road. Introduced as a technology component of Belt and Road Initiative, it covers everything from telecommunications and cloud computing to smart cities, artificial intelligence, and digital services. And Africa is becoming an important part of this digital expansion. Chinese technology companies, including Huawei and ZTE, have participated in telecommunications and smart city projects across the African continent. For African governments, the attraction is obvious. Many countries urgently need better internet connectivity. They need modern technology. They need modern telecommunications. They need digital government systems. They need better traffic management. They need improved emergency response. And they need technology that they can actually afford. Chinese companies have often been competitive on price and have offered complete technology packages. But this is where the story becomes controversial, because a smart city isn't only about convenience, it is also about information. Imagine a city where thousands of cameras are connected to one network. Traffic cameras identify vehicles. Facial recognition systems can help identify people. Sensors monitor roads. Command centers collect information. Artificial intelligence analyze patterns. Emergency services receive information in real time. On paper, this can sound like the future, and in some African cities, part of these technologies are already being deployed. Chinese companies have participated in what are commonly described as a safe city system in different countries. The stated objective is usually straightforward: reduce crime, manage traffic, improve emergency response, and make cities more efficient. And these benefits should not be dismissed. Africa has genuine security and infrastructure challenges, and governments have every reason to seek modern technology to address them. But there is another question: who controls the information? Who owns the data? Who has access to it? How long is it stored? What cybersecurity protection exists? And what happens when a country's critical digital infrastructure depends heavily on foreign technology? These questions have attracted concerns from researchers and governments around the world. Supporters see Chinese technology as an affordable path toward modernization. Critics worry about surveillance, cybersecurity, privacy, and the possibility that technological dependence could eventually become political dependence. The evidence does not support the simplistic idea that every Chinese camera is secretly collecting intelligence for Beijing. But neither should the strategic importance of digital infrastructure be ignored. Because once a country builds its own telecommunication networks, cloud systems, and digital services around particular technologies and standards, changing them later can be extremely expensive. And that gives infrastructure a new meaning. A railway can influence how goods move. A telecommunication network can influence how information moves, and information is power. So the big question is, why is China interested in building Africa's digital infrastructure? There is no single answer. There is money. Chinese technology companies gain access to enormous emerging markets. There is industrial strategy. China has built massive capabilities in telecommunications, electronics, engineering, and infrastructure. Africa offers new markets for those capabilities. There is no diplomacy. Infrastructure creates long-term relationships between governments. The digital Silk Road allows China to promote its technology, standards, and digital system beyond its borders. That matters because technology standards can last for decades. The company that builds today's network may have a relationship with tomorrow's network. The company that installs today's cloud infrastructure may help shape tomorrow's digital economy. And the country that becomes a major technology partner can become more than a supplier. It can become a long-term strategic partner. This is why the smart city story is not really about cameras. It is about infrastructure, markets, and influence. But if China's influence is growing, does that mean Africa is falling into a debt trap? Few phrases have become more controversial than China debt trap. The argument is simple. China lends huge amounts of money. A country struggles to repay. China gains privilege. Critics point to countries such as Zambia, Kenya, and others as examples of the risks surrounding large infrastructure borrowing. But the reality is more complicated. African debt crises rarely have one cause. Countries borrow from China. They borrow from the World Bank. They borrow from private bondholders. They borrow domestically. They face currency fluctuations. Commodity prices collapse. Interest rates rise. Government revenues fall. And suddenly, debt that once looked manageable becomes extremely difficult. China has also participated in debt restructuring and relief efforts rather than simply taking physical assets whenever a borrower encounters difficulty. The famous idea that China automatically takes an African port when a country cannot pay its debts is therefore far too simplistic. But that doesn't mean there is no risk. Debt is still debt. A railway that generates insufficient revenue can become a financial burden. A power project that fails to produce expected returns can strain government finances. And a government that borrows too much loses room to maneuver. The real lesson is not that Chinese loans are automatically good or automatically bad. It is this: the quality of the deal matters more than the nationality of the lender. A good infrastructure project can transform an economy, but a bad one can burden it for decades. By 2024, Chinese lenders signed only about $2.1 billion in new commitments across Africa, according to Boston University's latest database. Compare that with the gigantic financing deals of the previous decade. Something had changed. China had discovered that enormous overseas infrastructure loans also create enormous risks. African governments were carrying heavy debt burdens. Some projects struggled financially, and Chinese lenders themselves faced possibility of losses. So Beijing began changing the model. Instead of simply announcing another enormous railway or dam, China increasingly emphasized smaller and more selective projects, more commercial viable investments, more private investments, more industrial cooperation, more green energy, more digital infrastructure. Analysts often describe this shift as a more selective or small and beautiful approach. In other words, China did not leave Africa. It changed how it engages Africa. And this may actually be more important than the old lending boom, because the next phase may involve less money, but more targeted influence. China is not operating in an empty space. America is competing for influence. Europe is expanding its investment initiatives. India is deepening its African partnerships. Turkey is expanding trade and construction relationships. The Gulf states are investing heavily. Russia has built relationships in security and other strategic areas, and African governments increasingly understand that they have options. This creates an opportunity because Africa does not have to choose one global power. It can negotiate with all of them. China can build a railway. Europe can finance renewable energy. America can support technology and education. India can expand pharmaceutical and digital services. Gulf investors can build ports and logistic infrastructure. The real question is whether African governments can turn this competition into leverage, because the biggest mistake would be assuming that Africa is simply a passive recipient. It isn't. African governments signed the contracts. African governments borrowed the money. African governments decide where projects are built. And African governments ultimately decide whether infrastructure becomes an engine of development or another burden of taxpayers. Now we can finally answer the question: is China buying Africa? No. There is no secret transaction in which Beijing is acquiring an entire continent. But that doesn't mean nothing significant is happening. China is building something more complicated. A network of trade, loans, railways, ports, factories, telecommunications, technologies, digital systems, natural resource relationships, diplomatic partnerships, and business connections. Each individual project may look ordinary, but put thousands of these relationships together and they create something much larger: influence. And that influence does not necessarily mean control. China can benefit from Africa without controlling Africa. African countries can benefit from Chinese investments without becoming Chinese possessions. And both sides can pursue their own interests at the same time. The real question is therefore not, is China buying Africa? The better question is, who is negotiating the future and who is settling the terms? Because Africa needs infrastructure, it needs electricity, it needs railways, it needs factories, it needs internet connectivities, it needs technologies. And China has shown that it is willing to provide many of these things at a scale few other partners have matched. But infrastructure comes with contracts, loans comes with obligations, technologies comes with standards, and partnerships comes with influence. China's relationship with Africa is therefore neither the simple story of a generous friend nor the simple story of a secret colonizer. It is a much more complicated bargain. China wants markets, Africa wants development. China wants resources, Africa wants industrialization. China wants influence, African government wants partners. And somewhere between those interests lies the future of the continent. The age of China simply building Africa may be ending. The next phase is different. Smaller projects, more technology, more investments, more digital infrastructure, more competition, and potentially more influence per dollar. So, the question facing Africa was no longer whether China will be present. China is already here. The question is what African countries will do with that presence. Will they use Chinese capitals to build industries that eventually stands on their own? Will railways connect mines to factories or simply mines to ports? Will smart cities become tools for better public services or systems for excessive surveillance? Will digital infrastructure create African technology companies or permanent dependence on foreign technologies? And perhaps most importantly, can Africa negotiate with China from a position of strength? Because the future of the relationship will not be decided in Beijing alone. It will be decided in African capitals, inside government ministries, around negotiating tables, and ultimately what happens after the camera stops recording and ribbon cutting ceremonies are over. China is not buying Africa. It is investing in Africa's future. The question is, whose future will that investment create?